Right. So, hello everyone. Thanks for joining. It's the fifth installment of Fireside Management Chat, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have you all. Today we have with us Dr. Kevin Frick, who is a professor and vice dean of education at the Carey Business School at Hopkins. And the title or the topic of conversation would be how to be ever ready for a pivot. So Kevin will talk about his exciting journey from trying to be a chemist to becoming the Vice Dean of Education at Hopkins, and many interesting takeaways you can expect from this talk about learning, mentoring, networking, and obviously trying to pivot. All right, without further ado, I would like to go ahead and ask Kevin to take it away.
Well, thank you, Iqbal. And as you may have heard me saying in the lead up, since we have a small group, I'm going to, go through my presentation fairly quickly, and then as you're interested, we can go back and go into more detail in some of the areas and have much more of a discussion rather than just me, lecturing to you. But it is important to talk a little bit about who I am and how I got where I am before I give some advice and thoughts on being always prepared for a pivot. So right now, one part of my title is professor. So even with a highly administrative role, I still teach a course a year. I participate in other people's research programs. I haven't been the PI on anything in quite some time. I've been in this vice dean role for 8 years. I'm still an active professional association member, including some large scale projects that one of the professional associations is doing. It's trying to think of a whole new paradigm for the field. And I've been actively involved in that, and actually recently did an interview with a more junior faculty member in the School of Public Health that they're going to feature on their website. So still doing things like that. And then a member of the university community. So I'm not just teaching a class about health economics in the business school. I'm serving on the university's committee to choose a new learning management system. I've served on several search committees for different things. And I've just hired an undergrad as a research assistant, given her interest in health economics. So still all the standard things of a professor, it's just that's not all of my time. In terms of being an administrator, my team includes everyone from admissions. As you can see the list there, I won't read it out. It's a long list of things that have to do with the student experience. Basically, as I describe it, from the time you first start filling out that admissions form until the day you graduate, the staff who are going to be interacting with you are part of my team. In addition to institutional reporting, which basically means when the school has to get reaccredited, that's my team there. And then in addition to all that for work, I have a life outside of work as well. And it's just as important to remember that that's a part of who you are as well. In terms of how I got here, Iqbal had mentioned I tried to start out as a chemistry major. I'll give you the very short version of the story. I had a ton of AP credits when I started at Penn State. So in my freshman year, I didn't have to take the inorganic lecture, but they didn't let me place out of the lab. So I had organic lecture, inorganic and organic lab at the same time, 2 semesters of physics lecture and lab, 2 semesters of calc, and then a couple other random freshman courses. Somebody probably tried to tell me that wasn't a good idea, but I didn't listen, thought I knew it all. And by the end of that year, I was totally burned out. So my very first job had been working as doing housekeeping and maintenance at a boarding home for older adults. I knew one of the people who was running it had an MHA, seemed like an interesting path to take. So I switched into a department at Penn State called Health Policy and Administration. I quickly realized I was more interested in the policy and research side than in the administration side. So I decided to pursue a PhD in health services research with an economics focus. If you're interested, when I get through, I can tell you the whole story of how I went from an economics focus to a combined PhD in both economics and health services research. It certainly made me much more marketable in academic jobs for health economists. Got to writing my dissertation. I wrote an entirely theoretical dissertation on health insurance. So far, so good. Then I get a job at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. It was the only job offer I had. Not a bad one to get if you're only going to have one, but clearly theory, when you've got to get grants to fund your work, is probably not the way to structure your career. And so cost effectiveness was becoming something that was very popular, to including grants, both in the medical school, school of public health, also in the school of nursing. And so I took to focusing on cost effectiveness and quickly became the go-to person for people who wanted to include that in their grants. Um, did the right things to go from assistant to full professor in the School of Public Health. In the meantime, while doing all this research on cost and cost effectiveness, also found that I really enjoyed teaching. And again, there's a whole story then to when I got promoted to full professor, realized I enjoyed teaching, how that led to this opportunity to move to the Carey Business School. That happened, the discussion started. So I was promoted to full professor in January of 2010. A variety of things started happening. Fall of 2010, as I got involved in the Faculty Senate. Fall of 2011, as I was president-elect of the Faculty Senate. Realizing I liked things about administration that I was exposed to. And when our business school, the first dean left, first because the business school was just formed in 07, first dean left, new dean hired. He said he wanted to totally shake up his administrative team and wanted this role of vice dean for education as part of the school. And I got into that position. Again, I can elaborate more later on if you're interested, but one thing that's worth saying is that in my second interview for this position, the dean said to me, "I'm worried about your administrative wingspan." When somebody tells you that at your second interview, at least I left the interview thinking he's never going to offer me this position. To his credit, he did. He believed in me. And as you can see, the team that I lead now grew from 30 to about 80. And so, he trusted my administrative wingspan eventually and gave me opportunities to grow. And now, even though I've been vice dean for 8 years, and a lot of people say, well, when are you going to be dean and what school are you going to be dean at someday? I'm not even sure that's the best next move for me. It's what society thinks is the next logical move, but I'm not convinced that's what I want to necessarily do next. And I'm in the process of thinking to myself, what type of pivot would I want to make? So that's important as well. Um, it would be great to know, if I'm going to call on each of you just real quick. What did you come to Hopkins thinking you're going to do? Is there any pivot you're trying to plan for, and what concerns you most? And it would be great just to hear that from each of you. And then I can go on and give you my perspective, but shaped a little better by what you're answering to that. So Iqbal, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I came to Hopkins to pursue research, obviously. So I joined Hopkins 5 years back as a PhD student, and I'm still doing that. My primary, I was doing research during undergraduate, as an undergraduate, but I was mostly into the biomedical devices domain. And I wanted to do something more fundamental. So I realized that going into life sciences and trying to do things at the cellular scale makes more sense, both from a basic science perspective and also from a translational angle. So I have aspirations to right now. My goal is to become a professor and run a lab, uh, and I also do want to venture out and because I've been filing patents since my undergraduate time. So I do see myself as running a company while being able to run a decent lab in some institution. Yeah.
Thank you. Scott, how about you?
Can you hear me?
Just fine.
Okay, yeah. Somehow I closed my Zoom window, so I'm not even sure where I'm at. So I'm actually a PhD student in the history department, and so and I have a kind of a different background coming up to that as well. So I've pivoted multiple times, but when I entered the history department, my idea was that I would maybe pursue academia as a historian, but I always had an interest in business, and so my dissertation has kind of gone down that line. And during that period of time, I've kind of become disenchanted with academia, and I've decided to kind of pivot again toward consulting. So I guess that's where I'm at right now is, I guess my latest pivot.
Great. That's wonderful to hear. Allison, how about you? Well, we'll move on to Anushruti then.
Hi, I'm a master's student in the School of Public Health. I'm doing a master's in public health. I'm a physician from India, and I hope to work in policy makings for disease control and outbreak.
Wonderful. Carla, how about you? All right. Ivy, how about, do you have anything to say? Or Avi?
I mean, if you're trying to talk, you have to unmute yourself. So I think you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hey, this is Avi. Sorry, I'm a little late.
That's okay.
I'm currently an interventional spine fellow at the medical school, and I've been interested in consulting for a while. There was a time when I was in medical school where I thought I wouldn't do a residency. I actually interviewed for some consulting firms and chose to go with the residency after all. But the interest in consulting still remains, and hoping after fellowship's over, kind of find a good balance between working maybe as an adjunct professor at a medical school while also working for one of the big three consulting firms, ideally in healthcare.
Great. That's actually very exciting. And then we've got two other people whose names I don't see. If anybody wants to chime in. Well, regardless, and certainly feel free to chime in throughout. And I've got the chat open, and I do appreciate Ivy putting her answer on the chat board. There's a lot of things that can be challenging about a pivot, and especially for people who thought they were going to go into academia and are making a shift away from that, or much different expectations. So I'm somebody who grew up in a basketball family. My basketball skills do not show that I grew up in a basketball family, but when I think about pivots, that's certainly the sport that I think of. And there are many ways to be ready for a pivot in your career. And I'm going to give a few steps that I think are quite important for being ready. The first thing is having a mentor. Now, having a mentor is important throughout one's entire career, whether one is going to pivot or not. But certainly for me, when if I think about going back to, that stage of my career when I was ready to make a change from, a research-oriented faculty member in a school of public health to something else that had more to do with the education process than with being just a faculty member. That was where I went to several of my mentors. I remember, especially after I joined, after I became the president-elect of the Faculty Senate and really enjoyed some of the behind-the-scenes work on committees with the dean and decision-making that I got to be involved in, I called up one of the people who had been a casual mentor, if you will, to me when I was at the University of Michigan. And I knew he had had several roles in the dean's office when he was at Michigan. And his name also happened to be Dean. So I said to him, Dean, if I want to do more administrative work in my future, what should I do? He practically laughed at me on the phone. And when he got himself back together, he said, how many of your colleagues do you think would utter that same sentence? I said, I could probably count them on one hand. He said, same thing here. So just don't step back when they ask for volunteers. So that was one piece of advice. I've turned to the former dean of George Washington University School of Nursing, who has been a mentor to me for almost a decade now, on multiple times, both before I became vice dean here and as I think about what I want to do next. It's important to remember what a mentor is and is not. The mentor is not the one who's responsible for finding you a job. That's always your responsibility. The mentor certainly can make introductions for you, can facilitate access to their network for you. If there's very different levels of mentoring, some people just might be occasional advice, like my colleague Dean at the University of Michigan. Some people might be surface level, but regular. And then there might be people who you get to be at the level of a confidant with. They know what's going on in your life outside of academia. They can offer you advice and say, well, I could make this introduction, but you might want to think about this other choice given your other goals in life in general. But it's somebody who should hopefully be empathetic, who should be enthusiastically engaging with you, who should try to find ways to empower you, and who is, able to be their authentic self and encourage you to understand what your authentic version of success would be. Many different versions of, what defines a mentor. For me, that's the most important thing. And so again, I have, different mentors at very different levels, all of whom the most important thing about them is that they're willing to be honest with me in terms of whether they think it's a good idea, how to structure, and how to work around. So one thing is finding a mentor so that when you need to move forward, or you need that advice, and you want to say, well, I don't know whether I should go this direction or this direction. Sometimes you might have too many choices. And so having a mentor, especially one who might be at that level of confidant, trusted advisor, is critical for potential success. And I wanted to acknowledge Carla, thank you for putting your description in the chat box. So that's step one, finding a mentor and knowing how to engage your mentor and share with them your concerns if you're trying to make a pivot. I know one of the hardest things for me was that my graduate student advisor was a great mentor to me when I was a graduate student. But as I shifted from the type of research she did to cost effectiveness, and as I left research behind and moved into teaching and administration, I always worried, what's Catherine going to think of me? And that was a nice thing as well, to know that as a mentor, she would be honest if she thought it was truly a bad idea, but her main goal was my success. And again, finding a mentor who realizes that it's your success that's on the line and not their success that's on the line, in my mind, is critical. Second piece of advice that I would give you is to have a lifelong learning plan. I tried to find a non-gender specific image. It is what it is. Key though, any job that any of us has in academia, you're going to need a lifelong learning plan. As a researcher, you can't leave reading about new research, keeping up with other things behind. I think what's key, and one thing that I was reminded of when I moved between the School of Public Health and the business school, was that part of a lifelong learning plan obviously is keeping up with cost effectiveness and health economics in my professional role. But part of a lifelong learning plan is also occasionally reading about other things. And if I wanted to move up from being just, a PI to a really good PI, for example, then I really needed to learn some things about management. Now, to the dean's credit of the School of Public Health, not current Dean McKenzie, but her predecessor, he sent me to the university's leadership development program in 06-07. That was before I was even a full professor. I was honored that he did that, but I didn't have much power then. All I had was the power of persuasion. Still an important power to exercise among faculty, but I wasn't managing. So when I moved into this role where I've got to manage a team of 30, now 80, in addition to helping the dean with strategic decisions about the school and its educational programs, that required a lot of thinking on both sides. The university gave me access to a coach for the first 6 months I was in this role. She gave me a few starter books to read about managing people and thinking about your career and thinking about the future and how to plan in ways that I'd never had to before. And I realized then that there was as much that I could read about, managing people, human resources, conflict resolution, building your team, the professional development of your team, as much as I could learn about that in the long run as I had spent learning for my PhD. In fact, people do get PhDs in that area. Now, I'm not going to get another PhD, but I do need to make sure that I am clearly engaged in learning as I go along. And always asking myself, what is that next thing I might be interested in? And for example, right now, I've been a mentor to many people. I've given 4 different talks on mentoring, but most of my talks thus far have been from my own experience and my own intuition. There's a huge peer-reviewed literature on mentoring. So I've started to read that and think about how I want to use that as part of my professional future. And Gian and Allison, thank you for putting up your backgrounds as well. And I think that, again, it helps me to know what you're thinking about. The next thing to think about is networking. Part of what brought you here is to hear about my experience and my recommendations. But part of what hopefully brought you here is to network with other members of the Graduate Consulting Club. Whether you want to stay in touch with me or not, I would welcome that. Certainly, either through LinkedIn or coming to me for questions individually afterwards. I'm always happy to have conversations. But building a network, and you never know how that network is going to be important. I mentioned I could tell a little bit more about the story of the transition between schools. One of the things that led to that transition was my dean's lecture. So the School of Public Health has this tradition. When you get promoted to full professor, you get to give a lecture on a topic of your choice. So I gave a lecture on the future of teaching cost effectiveness in health economics. One of the people who was sitting in the audience that day was the gentleman who had been the chair of biostatistics when I arrived at Johns Hopkins, and who at that time was in the provost office as a vice provost. So he heard me talk about my interest in teaching. So he knew when the new dean came into the business school and asked around the provost office, hey, does anybody know somebody who might want this vice dean for education position? He was able to say, I have just the person for you. So networking involves a couple of things. One, just knowing more people. Two, making sure that at least some of those people are more than just business cards or LinkedIn links, but you actually know them. And three, telling your story. Obviously, when it's time for that transition, you're really going to have to think about how to tell your story. But, my dean's lecture was part of my telling my story. I was telling the whole world, I'm interested in more than just teaching and research, more than just research, and probably more than just teaching, but thinking about new ways of improving teaching as I move forward. And that gave people some knowledge and information about what I was interested in and made them better able to think on my behalf, what could I connect Kevin to when there's that opportunity? And so form a network. I know many people in academia are introverts on the Myers-Briggs. It can be a lot of effort. I will tell you that until I was in the business school, I wouldn't go so far as to say despised, but found challenging networking events. I'm sure many of us do, but you can start with a simple goal. Go to a networking event and think to yourself, can I find one person to introduce myself to? And you get a little bit better at that, and it becomes easier over time. And also, many professional associations, when you go to conferences, have built-in networking opportunities that do make it easier and easier as you move further into your career and have more opportunities. And the importance of the network actually becomes even more critical as you move forward, because you really, you get to a point like I am in my career. I've been at Hopkins, it'll be 25 years in July. I really know what I want to do. So I can now go to a much wider network and say, who do I know that can really help me meet this goal, where I can choose what's next for me, rather than just, throwing my hand up in the air and say, well, I'll take whatever opportunity comes next. So it's important to build that network and have a network. And again, just one other quick example of, people who come to me. We had a full-time MBA student who was looking to interview at the Lego company, like literally the company that makes the little blocks. It's a great company to work for. And she said, oh, I see there, one of your LinkedIn connections is also a Cary grad who works there. Do you know that person very well? And the funny thing was, we'd sent out a miscommunication about our pass-fail choices for the fall. That one student had written to me to ask for clarification. And then I had followed up with her and said, tell me a little bit about what you do in addition to being a Cary, which she did. And it was wonderful then to see, that my ability to connect these two Cary affiliates. So remember that if you're going to transition, it is kind of like starting over. This is a picture of the, it's not my own Atari 2600 from my childhood, but this is my favorite gaming system in my childhood, Game Reset. So sometimes, it is like a reset, whether it's moving from history to consulting, whether it's moving from just worrying about the inventions to the business of the inventions. And sometimes you're going to have to reconfigure where it is that you think you're going to enter that next position, because you haven't necessarily developed that same level of expertise in the new role that you're looking for. And so coming to grips with what does that mean to you and how to use all of the experiences that you have, all of the all of the knowledge that you've gained in order to have the best opportunity possible in the new field after you've pivoted is something that's quite important. So you need to plan for that and be aware of that. Having a narrative. So this was from the New York Times website, and it was, knowing my story and how do I tell it? And that's really important when you're making a career pivot. When I met Dean Ferrari the first time, when I was interviewing for the business school job, I had to explain to him how, once thought he was going to be a chemist, became cost effectiveness researcher who loved teaching, now suddenly wanted to move into an administrative role in a business school and not a school of public health. I needed a narrative around that. Even when I went up for promotion to full professor, I'll be honest, I had a line of research of cost effectiveness with nurses, a line of research cost effectiveness with ophthalmologists, and a line of cancer survivorship research. And multiple of my mentors had said, could you focus a little more multiple times in my career? And I never did, but I was able to weave together a story about why this was a coherent set of things that I had done research on that should get me promoted to full professor. So I've needed to worry about my narrative multiple times. And even right now, as I think about what do I want to do, again, 8 years into this job as vice dean, what do I want to do next? When do I want it to come? I have to have a narrative that I tell people about. Here's what I'm thinking about. Here's what I'd like to do. Can you help me think about the next step? So all of us need the narrative. And particularly when you're making a pivot, the narrative becomes even more important. Why are you interested in this? What are the things that you've already done that could help you make this transition? And what are the things that you've already done that would actually set you apart from people who train in this area in the first place? Maybe it's important that you have a different perspective or you add something to the discussion that people who are there already don't have. I mentioned I had interviewed a more junior faculty member for the professional association that I'm a part of. And within health services research, there have been some people in social epidemiology, but it's fairly new. So I was able to say to her, as you look at taking your career and moving into this area, what is it that you need to know? Remember, this is not going to happen overnight. So, when I think of not happening overnight, I always think of, the expression that Rome wasn't built in a day. So I found a fun little cartoon to remind us of that. It's going to take planning. It's going to take time, and having reasonable expectations about how much planning and how much time are both important. And the amount of planning is going to depend on just how radical of a shift you're looking to make. And for those who are looking at consulting, certainly while you haven't necessarily been faculty yet, you have an idea of what a faculty life looks like, the demands on their time, how many nights they spend, working after dinner, how many weekends they spend working. As my fellow vice dean says, as a faculty member, she gets to choose which 80 hours a week she works, but she still has to work the 80 hours a week. Now, whether it's quite that bad or not, it's another issue entirely. But the key is you have an idea of what the expectations of weekend work, travel for conferences, evening work, how it takes, how much effort it takes to stay on top of things in an academic setting. If you're looking at a non-academic setting, if you're looking at a startup, if you're looking at consulting, what is that life like? What does it take? And are you ready for that when you make that transition? All of these things are going to help to determine how long it's going to take you. But the one thing that I can assure you is it's not going to be overnight. I've mentioned a couple things about interpersonal relationships, and I just want to bring that back again, whether it's the mentor, whether it's the network, whether it's, people you're working with, people you've worked with or worked for in the past, nurturing those relationships, keeping them strong, figuring out reasons to be in touch again are quite important. I'll give you a wonderful example that just happened this week. There was a PhD student in the program that I was in back in the School of Public Health who came to us in the late 90s. She spent nearly the maximum amount of time that the university allowed in the PhD program, initially became an academic in one institution. decided to leave academia and go into business. She's now a vice president at Highmark. Great for her. It's a health insurance and health information company. And we talked in person, well, Zoom, which is as close to in person as we're going to get anytime, for the first time in years earlier this week. But it's a relationship that we've nurtured because, I knew from the beginning she was advised by my fellow health economist, but her mind thought much more in the very applied way of cost effectiveness that I used than the more theoretical, higher level analytics that my colleagues used. Again, not judging, just different ways of thinking about things. And so she and I engaged. We'd stayed in touch for quite some time. I'd watched her progress in her career. Now she wants an introduction to somebody I've known since my graduate school days. And I can make the introduction for her. But in the process of our conversation on Monday, found out how much we both love mentoring and how we might try to collaborate on issues around mentoring. So we'll have two health economists collaborating on something that's about human relations. Again, not bad, just an interesting variation from where we might have expected to ever collaborate when I first met with her in the late 90s when she was a PhD student here. And as you build those interpersonal relations and build your network, one way to think of it is having a pyramid plan. So this is from a TV commercial back in the 70s and 80s. It was a shampoo commercial. And it started out with one woman talking about how much she liked the shampoo. And she told two friends, and they told two friends. And it went on for a couple more times. And I think the screen was probably divided into 16 or 32 or 64 by the time the commercial ended. But you get the point. The key is if you need information that you don't have about what it might be like after you pivot, or connections to get you into the field that you want to pivot to, start by saying, here's two persons that I want to talk to about this new field. And maybe they're not the ones who are going to help you to get the job, or maybe they're not the ones who have the position they can offer you. But get an informational interview. People love to talk about themselves. Informational interviews are much easier. And in these days of virtual meetings with Zoom, it's much easier to take 15, 30 minutes with somebody than it used to be if you had to try to meet them for coffee or meet them for a lunch. So, even in 15 to 30 minutes, think about the most important questions you have for that person. And then at the end, if they don't have that, immediate job to offer or idea for how you could work for their company, ask them, do you have two people you could recommend that I talk to next? And that's a really powerful way. And by the time you've talked to the first two people, and then they've recommended two people, and if each of them can recommend two more people, and you build an entire network like that, again, it's the pyramid or the exponentiating plan would be another way of phrasing it. It's a great way to build and build and build so that you can make a much more informed decision about your pivot. Earlier this week when I was talking to undergrads at Penn State in Alumni in the Classroom Day, I was speaking with another alumni who was 10 years younger than me, and she talked about talking to 117 people before her most recent career pivot. That's a huge number of people to talk to, but it illustrates this idea of a pyramid plan, having a plan for reaching out and then extending 2 times 2 times 2 as you go along until you've gotten all the information you think you need to make the pivot. So with that, just a reminder, mentors, lifelong learning plan, general networking, be ready for a bit of a start over, develop your narrative, recognize that it's going to take time, and get all the information that you can until you are ready to make that pivot from your strongest point possible and ready to push forward, much like the basketball player would with the drive to the hoop for the layup for your next step in your career. And with that, I'd love to open it up to questions, or addressing some of the issues that people brought up. And I'm happy to let's see, it doesn't look like anybody's put questions in the chat yet, but you can either put them in the chat, or if you've got your microphone working, feel free to jump in.
That was great, Kevin. So please feel free to ask questions if you have. So,
Go ahead.
yeah, one question is that I've been, so I like someone said that they, I mean, I think it was Abby who was doing history, and then they started doing something else. So I have not done such a like dramatically different jump. I was doing mostly research, but I jumped from being a materials engineer to now life sciences, and then now I want to do developmental biology. So one thing is that I've been trying to do multiple projects. Like I have a main project, and I've been trying to collaborate with other professors. And I mentioned one PDP as well, right? So I did multiple projects, and so in that process, what happens is that time management is extremely important, right? Because you are trying to do this and that, and I've been trying out different methods. So, I mean, do you want to? I mean, it would be great to know how do you manage your time. I mean, from a personal point of view, do you make a to-do list every day and all those things?
That's a great question. I do have a to-do list. In my administrative role, I often get distracted from my to-do list. But there's a couple things to think about. One, there's a lot of books out there or other articles about to-do lists these days where look at your to-do list and decide at the beginning of the day, no matter what else happens, these three things have to get done. And if you have enough control over your own day to schedule an hour at the beginning of the day when you keep it open, you can probably get at least one of those things done during that hour. I know a lot of times, the number of times I've said to a colleague, if I could just open up 15 minutes, I could read this. And they're like, why can't you find 15 minutes? I'm like, well, we got, COVID, and we got, rescheduling, we got uncertain numbers of students. They're like, fine, just make the 15 minutes. So that would be one idea. I think the other thing is patterns and regular and consistency. I have journaled about each day now for a little over 4 years. I passed 1,500 days in a row. Does two things for me. One, I either begin the day or end the day with it. So that's part of my pattern. It's part of my regularity, and it helps me to focus either on what I did do or what's coming up for the day. And having that sense of this is the way I'm going to structure my day, and can I allocate? First half of the day is for project number one, early afternoon is for project number two, late afternoon is for project number three. Depending on what skills you need to apply in the different projects, you might actually want to think about like which project requires the most clear thinking. For me, I would schedule that first thing in the morning. Which project do I just slog through? Well, I'd probably put that after lunch. And so you can be strategic about it. And so I think it's key to be, recognize your own limitations, be strategic about it as you can, and, realize that you're probably never going to get through a 20-item to-do list in a day, at least at the level of things that you and I are doing. I mean, maybe an administrative assistant might have to get through 20 things in a day, but those tend to be much more compact to-dos. But again, if you put your top three each day, and then if you're not even getting done your top three, you really have to ask yourself why. There's no easy answers to that, but that would be a time to say, what am I doing wrong that I can't even get done my top three each day that I say are my highest priority?
Yeah, yeah. No, I totally understand. I mean, what you said about uh, knowing your limitation. I have been struggling with uh, one thing that I realized that I underestimate is the time needed to do something. So I would just write down, and then I would think that, well, I would need 1 hour to do this, 1 hour to do that, and I end up realizing that, well, I spent it instead of 1 hour, I did spend 2 hours on that, or maybe 1 hour. Like it's kind of frustrating, but I'm learning how to estimate the time. I think that's where I'm not really good at estimating the time. Sometimes some experiments take more time. Sometimes even an email takes more than 10 minutes to write. So yeah.
I know that story about long emails, and certainly others should feel free to jump in with questions, but I'm going to tell you a quick story about time. So again, in my faculty professor role, I will occasionally get invited to be on committees for things. So I had been contacted by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. They were forming a committee to review two monographs. They were studies that had been commissioned by the Department of Veterans Affairs, looking at service dogs versus emotional support dogs for veterans with PTSD, and which one was more effective and more cost effective. And I thought that would be a really interesting thing to be involved in. It took 3 weeks for the people who were running this committee to schedule an interview with me to see, would they even want to put forward my name for a nomination. In those 3 weeks, even though we're now, coming up on a year of dealing with COVID, you would think things would be getting simpler. They started getting more complex rather than less complex. So rather than waste the time of these people from the national academies yesterday, and I hated to do it on the same day, but I wrote them yesterday morning and said, since we set this meeting up, my life's gotten more complicated rather than less. So can you tell me just how much time does this take? And the person, being completely honest, wrote back and said, takes about as much time as usually takes to write a chapter with a group of co-authors. And alarm bells went off in my mind. I'm like, I don't have time to be on a co-author on a chapter in the next 12 weeks. No can do. And so I politely said to her, of all the things in my career, chapters always take longer than I expect them to. Now, maybe I need to get better at estimating how much time it's going to take in the first place. But knowing that and knowing my experience, I really thought to myself, this would not be good for me or for them if I accept this committee invitation. And so again, I hated to cancel the meeting the day of, but they will be happier and I will be happier in the long run. I see Allison has put in a question. How do you design a lifelong learning plan if you're not sure about the future opportunities? Well, I think I always like to go back to something that Dean Ferrari, who hired me to the business school, said. So he actually had several pivots as well. He was an MD, JD, MBA. He had started his career running a surgery unit in a hospital in Louisiana. He then rose to director level at McKinsey in consulting. And then his deanship was his retirement gig. So he would tell MBA students at orientation, read at least one article, preferably more, from the Wall Street Journal every day. So an MBA student typically comes to Carey thinking, oh, well, I want to do healthcare. I want to do energy. I want to do finance. I want to do management consulting. But if they read one article from the Wall Street Journal every day, hopefully they're not just reading healthcare articles from the Wall Street Journal. I'm not even sure that they have one a day. So you're going to then start reading other things. You're going to spread out a little bit. You're going to branch out. So part of having a lifelong learning plan is just saying, okay, I could read, me as a cost effectiveness expert who focuses on care of things related to ophthalmology and optometry. Could I find one optometry or ophthalmology cost effectiveness article to read every day of the year? Probably. But if I only read that, I could be the world leading expert on that, and that would be great. Nothing wrong with that. We need people in the world like that. That wouldn't be my style. And if you want to pivot, it shouldn't be your style either. So you could begin by saying, what's tangentially related to what I'm doing? Maybe if you're going to read professionally every day, maybe say Tuesdays, I'm going to read something that isn't directly in my area, but tangentially related. And so you start to branch out a little bit. If you're really ambitious, and you want to say 2 days a week, you'll make it, that you could do that. Just something to start going a little bit aside. I mean, I think everybody should probably read about human relations and management, because even if you're an academic, the chances are someday you will have to manage. Okay, you're going to be a principal investigator if you're an academic. You got to manage a lab and a research team. If you're going to even for somebody in a history department, and I think Scott was the one who was the historian who's no longer on. But even if you're in a history department, what if you want to be chair someday? Well, that chair has a budget. That chair has HR issues, and so even faculty who want to become leaders within a department, leaders within a school, need that. So the one thing you could easily begin with is read something about human relations as like part of your professional reading 1 day a week. And maybe that would then get you interested. Well, maybe within human relations, it's diversity issues. Maybe within human relations, it's mentoring. Maybe within human relations, it's critical conversations and managing through change. There's all sorts of things that you might branch out into. And so my best piece of advice is start small. It doesn't have to be that different from what you're doing, But if you let yourself wander down a path here and there, and it's obviously slow motion compared to going down a rabbit hole on the internet once you've started searching, and then say, oh, well, that, and then that, and then that, and then that. If it's once a week, it's going to be slow motioning compared to what you would do with, endless searches and following different links, keeping you up late at night on the internet. But that would be how I would think of it. So use whatever you're interested in first as a way to guide that first thing off to the side, and then say, oh, well, if I'm interested in that, maybe I could take the next step and see what becomes of that. So I think that's a great question. I hope you found that a useful perspective, Allison. And certainly if you had asked me, I mean, it's something that I really encourage students to begin while they are students, because I wasn't. I mean, yeah, I've got my little side things. I've been a runner. I like to write poetry. Great. But, those aren't things that are going to become my money-making part of my career. Is there a new thing that I could do? Reading about business. I mean, the other nice thing is, you can use LinkedIn Learning, how to write a business plan, like little things like that to get you started. You don't always, the lifelong learning plan doesn't always have to involve more degrees. I mean, I've taught students who have lots of degrees. When I taught my frameworks for analyzing healthcare markets course last fall, I had a guy who was he was an attorney. He was getting his MBA. He was going to go on to a leadership program at Stanford. Good for him. That's wonderful. But, did he need the MBA? I won't say he didn't, but he probably could have learned enough about business through other means. And then for the leadership program, does he need a whole certificate from Stanford? Again, perhaps not, but he could certainly benefit from it. But he can titrate, how much does he need? If he wants to dedicate the time and the money, by all means, great, earn the degree. But, you can figure out, do I need just to know some basics that I could get from, reading a couple books, asking a couple friends, having the support that I need, or do I want to develop true subject matter expertise? And again, my own exploration of mentoring is a great example. I can do the mentoring with a good intuition and a good level of engagement with the people I'm mentoring. But if I then want to be invited to give more presentations and serve on committees, then I need to have actual, some subject matter expertise. And so that has led me to read, all sorts of things, which, I know the first person I want to visit post-pandemic is a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. So it isn't even their main campus, but she's one of the foremost authorities on mentoring in the workplace. And I would love to spend maybe find something to do other than just visit her. But I would literally travel just to have lunch with her, to have a uninterrupted one-on-one conversation, because that's how critical that area is for my professional future.
Great. Do we have more questions? Okay, if not, let's see. Yeah, I don't think we have more questions. Well, thanks a lot, Kevin, for your
welcome.
Insight and motivational talk. And for those of you who are interested in life sciences, the next couple of fireside management chats are going to be specifically for that. That will include interactive case studies, and we have invited people from consulting companies like LEK and Simon Kucher to bring in staff from the recruitment committee and talk about what they look at different profiles. Well, with that, I'd like to thank Kevin again, and thank you all for joining us today, and we'll meet again. Thank you.